I got it. It was in my touch bar. All right.
There
Does
we
everyone?
go.
Okay.
Nice.
Nice.
Woo.
All right. Officially, let's kick off. So, thank you everyone for joining. Um, I know this is a contentious topic usually, but we wanted to bring it up to everyone because a lot of people who are starting with Ionic are still deciding whether or not to choose Angular or React. So, hopefully, this will help you guys choose. And without further ado, Greg, would you like to introduce us?
Welcome to the Ionic Game Show, where we pair up two technologies to battle it out until you decide who wins. And now, the proton to your neutron, your host, Claudio.
All right. Thank you for the warm welcome, sir. So to kick off, let me show you guys the schedule. We're going to kick off with three topics, both with their Angular and React implementations. The first is going to be Ionic Controllers. We're going to be taking a look at how Ion modals are used in Angular and React with Fernando and Harry. Then next up, we got Ionic Navigation. We're going to take a look at tabs and side menu navigation. I know from my experience, this is usually a project that brings up some problems for beginners. I know it's difficult for me to get it just from looking at the code. So hopefully our speakers will be able to provide us with their opinions, preferences, and any hiccups that they experience while doing this. And last, we are going to end with Ionic Navigation, deep linking with Capacitor with Pablo and Greg. So as we go on, feel free to post questions on the chat. We'll be taking a look at those perhaps after each round. And if it's something that maybe requires a little bit more detail, maybe we can dive into it in the end. But without further ado, Fernando, you are first up.
Okay.
Oh, and also I prepared some humor for this. So I am not a comedian, but I did write these. So this is a little stab at having the template and the logic with React. I think that sometimes it's very easy to go very long. But anyway, all right, Fernando, you are up.
Okay, so I think this is the first meetup I joined, so I will make a small presence. I'm working for OpenForce. I'm from Spain, based on Madrid, so you can ask me anything by Twitter or on the meetup or whatever. So talking about the models for the Angular side, I would say in this case, I think Angular and Ionic works better than React and Ionic. The way that it's implemented on with Angular, I think is easy for the developer to handle different scenarios. And the thing that most like me is the easiest way to have handle the flows for the results of the models. For example, there is the role property on the response of the models that you can define and use for any kind of uses. For example, in this case, I create some custom example. For example, if you open the model for the users and logins, for example, depends of the buttons, you can return different role and you can process the response with whatever flow you want to do that. Or for example, another scenario, if you have the model with 3 different ways to leave that, for example, the close and 2 buttons, you can actually triggers after that the mechanic related to that flow. If you want make something specific for one button, you can do that. And then if you want to do that for the close button, you usually don't want to make something, then you can ignore that. So I think that's a good point on the model implementation with Angular. I don't know if there is something more to discuss about the Ion models. I think that's all my opinion.
Sorry, I might have not been paying attention. Did you talk about the responses?
What do you mean about the responses?
Yes. So the on dismiss, I think we'll see once we take a look at the React sample. But you mentioned that this is not used often, or it could be used more.
Yes, in my experience, I started using this recently. I found this very useful in the past months. So I think we can try to use it more because it's quite flexible and it's helpful to make some difference in the flows for the user's experience. So
And
that's my case. I don't know if this is widely used, but in my case, I started using this quite recently. So that's why I think this should be said, because I don't know if this is commonly known.
yes, cool. Well, I don't think anyone's got any comments or questions so far, so I think we are ready to move on to the React side with Harry.
Right. I actually uploaded an example with Redux Toolkit. It uses, or it actually has this option to create slices of Redux state. It's just a really clean way to kind of, you know, group those different parts of actions and reducers into, a more scoped context instead of having like a folder of all your actions or a folder of all your reducers. And I even added an example where, instead of calling an action from this Redux modal, I just grabbed any action, and you can add it to the reducers that way. So Ion modals use React portals under the hood that render them outside wherever you're declaring that component. So you don't have to worry about where you put your Ion modal tags in React. It works just like a template. There's a few ways to dismiss them, and I kind of showed two, and there's some caveats. You can't, or you can dismiss Ion modals from the modal controller that's in Ionic Core, but all that does is query for Ion modal in the DOM and then just call the dismiss method for the first one that it finds. So instead of that, here I have a reference to the Ion modal element, and then on that I'm just calling dismiss directly. And you don't want to toggle that state that displays whether it's open or not, both in some button that would close and the on dismiss, because that would trigger two actions. So what I have here is on dismiss, I'm going to set the is open state to false, but inside the modal, I'm just dismissing with the modal controller. That means that the dismiss dispatch is only going to run once, whether you click the close button or you click the backdrop to the modal. With the web version, there's backdrops that will cause the modals to dismiss, and if you don't have that logic there for the on did dismiss, then you're not going to be able to open your modal again, because even though it was dismissed in the controller, it's going to try and present again, but the is open is going to be false, and it's going to prevent it from doing so. And you could just use state for is open, but I just went with this example just to stop re-renders for any page that might declare and hold state for a modal. And
So since you have, oh, sorry, go ahead. All right, so since you have experience using both, for a beginner, if you say someone was trying this out first in React and then they would look at Angular, I think for me, like the biggest disparity is that in Angular, you're working within the component that is the modal itself. And there you have like your services, your logic and whatnot. You can even dismiss it using the actual Ionic controller. And you mentioned that with React, it's a little bit different how that works.
Yeah, just because you don't have a reference to the modal controller that belongs to the component when you create it. I went through and tried using the modal controller, but looking at the source code, it's, you know, what you would need to do to actually create a modal with a reference to the component. Like you'd have to do all the portal yourself and all just a bunch of stuff that's not worth it. But that kind of, for me, is the benefit in Angular, is that, you know, you can just use, you know, some of the framework of Angular to just have these component factories that create very nicely. But also there's a catch to that, which is, and I've seen it in a lot, which is that, you know, you're just presenting and presenting a modal with a click of a button, but you're going to have to check if that modal is open anyways. So you're almost kind of manually doing something that React forces you to do, which is managing the state of whether a modal is open or not. Just because you're not going to create multiple modals with Ion modal and React, like often happens in Angular.
Yeah, and oftentimes the solution that that I've seen personally is just like nuking all of anything that's open, close it all, you know, just so you don't have to maintain the state of which one is open. Any particular advantages that you noted using the React implementation?
Kind of just that. You know, if you're modal, I mean, modals usually only need one instance. Like you usually don't need more than one modal of the same kind. And with Angular, you're either going to have to wrap the dismiss in like a switch case, or you know, getting into observables there is not ideal. But other than that, you're just going to have to manage the state yourself and do these checks every time you click a button. Whereas with ion modals, you know, it's a component with state already, and then you're just presenting it based on something that's more easy to control.
Okay. Now, Fernando, having seen this, I know it was very brief, but I personally, when seeing the React implementation, it's just the main thing is having the modal in the template itself. To me, it seemed like it could get bloated pretty fast, especially if you have two different modals that could open with different actions. And if you have to add each of them individually, it might get confusing. I prefer my templates to be as readable as possible. And I don't know if you think that's something that could prevent that.
Can you repeat the last part of the question?
Yeah, so like my problem, or I guess my opinion, was that if you have to put the different ion modal components in the template, that's right, Harry, right? You would have to put different ones in
Yeah.
yeah, so like, I don't know, do you share my opinion? Or
Yes, I think in my opinion, I think I like get all these components and templates extractor as single as possible. So I will prefer my single component with my single modal, and then another single component with another single modal. So each modal is individually and has its own mechanic flow, whatever you want. So I think I prefer individual instead of multiple models in one file.
I mean, instead of bloating the JSX, you're really just bloating the modules with your declarations, your entry components, and all that. I mean, you got to specify it somewhere.
all right. Well, I posed a question in the chat. If anyone has experience using either the Angular or the React version, um, we'd love to hear your thoughts. But if not, then we can go ahead and move to the next example, which might require me to stop presenting and actually zoom in because it might be a little bit big. But we're going to start off on the Angular side with Luis, and then we're going to follow with the React implementation with Min. And again, this is when you have both tabs and navigation and side menu, so you can have multiple pages that have the tabs layout and the side menu acting as like the main point of navigation for that. And yeah, so for this next little piece of humor, I referenced the learning curve between Angular and React. I know for me, it took me quite a while to become familiar with it, but once we started playing around with React, after following the docs, it seemed pretty straightforward and it allowed me to jump right in. So if anyone in the audience feels the same, let us know. And and without further ado, Luis, let us know. Oh, wait, I thought it was the.
I think here is React first.
Oh, it looks like I messed them up. So, Min, looks like you're up first. So, how is the readability here? Do I need to go out and zoom in?
Yeah, you're gonna have to zoom
Yes,
in.
because it's so tiny.
Yeah,
Oh, right.
you just need to go into like the app portion. None of that stuff at the top is really important.
Okay, so I think. Is that better?
Yeah, zoom out a little bit. Yeah, and down. Yeah, that's it. That's all you needed.
All right. Take it away.
Cool. Yeah. So what's really nice about Ionic is that even though they're using their own components like the Ion React router, all they're doing is they're actually just like wrapping a pre-existing library called like React router. That's already a really like feature rich like way of routing. I personally really like Ionic routing more than Angular, mainly because at the end of the day you're still just going back to using components, and you're not really having to learn a whole lot of like config based like routing like how Angular does with the modules. It's everything in here is like pretty clean. The only annoying thing is that you have to read up a little bit on what like child components have to be, which could lead to a couple of like issues if you're not looking at like how to structure your components. But honestly, it's like all you need to know is just Ion and React router, and inside all you need is routes in there, right? And then like the Ion router like outlet, like that is essentially just like a giant switch with all these routes. And I think the code is pretty clear. Like for instance, if you're on /tabs, it's gonna render the main tabs component. And what's great is that like you can just like subroute these, and inside like main tabs you can have even like you can go to the next one.
Yeah.
Oh, that's the menu. Can you go to the next one? Cool. Is there one that's like main tabs?
There we go.
That one. So that one is like, again, this is the main tabs is like that view where you can choose like the icons on the bottom, right? But all you're really essentially doing is like setting like those anchor like the hrefs on any of those, right? And then at the top you're saying like for each one of these routes they're all linked up this way. One thing like that's might be a little bit difficult is that you can actually have your routing logic spread all over the app, which could actually make it a little bit challenging for some people. But what I like about Ionic's implementation, React's implementation, is that it's really easy to get up and running, but it takes a lot more discipline to make sure that you keep it clean in very few places of the app. That's very clear. But my favorite thing about all this is just that because at the end of the day, all these things are just components. You're not learning anything new. And what's really powerful about how like React does all this is that you can writing like tests to prove your routing is actually really clean and simple, because you can even write a reusable render function for all your routing, so that, for instance, if you go to slide 13 now, I think, where is it? Yeah, this one.
Oh, this one?
Yeah. So this is a simple. This is literally just a util file for rendering any component, right? And if you have any component that does any form of routing, right, or even like anchor tags or redirects, you could just wrap that component in this function, right? And then you can actually test against the history logic. Did you put the test I think I sent you?
Oh, I don't think I did actually, but
It's okay.
okay.
But yeah, but I'm saying like it's really easy to write tests for this too, because all you have to do is just render your component out, and then it's just basically the same kind of unit testing.
You mentioned that it might be difficult if you have navigation spread out through your app. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Oh, I mean, again, all these are just components, right? Whereas in an Angular, it forces a convention of like routing, module, Whereas in React, all the routes are just components, right? So like most of the time, as you see in that app file, like all your routes are like in there, or maybe like a level or two down, depending on your UI. Like for instance, you can have like your main dashboard's toolbar at the top, and then you can have another route like inside of it, because you want that header on all your pages. But depending on your route, you want a different UI for those views, right? So depending on the complexity of your app, and you might actually have all your routing like sub-routing and sub-routing down, right? And it could be in multiple places. That's when like it can get confusing if you don't keep track of where all that logic is. But that doesn't really happen unless it's like like those like really monolithic apps. That's where it gets really hard to manage. It's like you're not following a routing convention like that Angular forces you to have.
Yeah, well, I gotta tell you, when I saw this example, I think it won me over. Haven't done the Angular one before. I know it's easy to get on the first try, but after looking at your code, it was much more intuitive. However, we'll let Luis give us his take on that. But thank you, man. All right. I'm gonna stay like this because I think the Angular examples are also we might have to see.
Yeah, so here what we have is like the main side menu. So we have, I can barely see it. Okay. Yeah, so we have like the header of the menu, then the Ion list with the different buttons to go to different, they will have Ion menu toggles to open or close the menu, and with the routes, their icon and their labels. And if you go to like the first ones, actually route between the tabs also. And the last one uses like a function and click on logout that we can see on the next slide. That, for example, that will show you how you could even implement to do something first, like clearing the user data, and then navigating to, in this case, a page that is outside of the tabs routes. And yeah, the next one, this one is the routing that Ming was talking about. So we have these are the main routes to go to the authentication module or to the tabs module. And the tabs one even has an out guard, so it will not let you go in unless you're authenticated. The next one is the tabs, the tabs routing. So yeah, this is once you go to the tabs route, you will enter to these routes within the tabs module. So these are the routes for each of the pages of the tabs. So each of those goes, for example, to the dashboard page module, to each of the modules that are related to each one of the tabs. We can go to the next one. This is the actual Ion tabs component. So we have the tab bar with the slot set to the bottom. And then for each, we have the tab button with the tab name that will be matched to the route that it will go to. And we have the icon and the label for each of those. And on the last slide, the next slide, what we have is like example of one of those pages where we will have the Ion header with the toolbar and the Ion menu button to open or close the side menu. and the title that will show on the header, and then you will have your page content inside Ion content. So yeah, related to what Min was talking about, what I think I value more on this Angular implementation, even if it's more code and more files, I think once you learn the main concepts of Angular, it will be much more readable and much easier to follow what everything is doing and all the flows. And I think it will be easier for collaboration because like I've seen Min's example implemented in different ways. But since Angular has more conventions and is much more opinionated, like if the developers understand the concepts, it's easy to predict the way they will implement things. So I think in bigger projects, it's easier for collaboration. And if you're new to a project that is already big and with a lot of developers, I think in Angular, it would be much easier for you to just start looking at the code and understanding their implementation and the thought process that they use to implement all the functionality there.
Great. Min, any thoughts after hearing that?
One thought I have is this is actually, out of all the examples here, this one truly shows the biggest differences between React and Angular. Seeing that I've had both experiences, you can do the same thing in React that you can in Angular's, the way it's opinionated and all that. There's some more flexibility. So kind of like what he said, to the point, a larger project, Angular might be the best, and on a smaller project, React might be the best. But this definitely accents the pros and cons to both implementations out of all the examples we'll be showing today.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to my little dig here with the learning curve. Yeah, like starting Angular and seeing an example like that, I definitely would have been daunted and probably would have not gotten it unless I did it myself and really understood what like the routes are and nesting and all that. However, seeing the React one first glance, I definitely felt like it was a little bit more intuitive. But again, in larger projects, the predictability is an asset in this case.
Yeah, and I think it goes back also to one thing that means that, for example, if you go with Angular like this, you have to take time to learn the concepts and understand like the rules and everything. But then everything that you do follows that. But in React, you have to be very disciplined in your day-to-day work to make things clean and make it work better for collaboration, I think.
I just want to interject that we should probably mention that the reason the Angular routing is kind of hard to read there is because it's lazily loading your Angular modules. And I think that was the syntax in the slide is for Angular 7 too. I mean, the syntax for lazy loading modules is a little bit better, but it's not a starter concept in Angular at all. So it's pretty easy to get tripped up on that if you're just going to start Angular for the first time and you have to deal with lazy loading modules right off the bat in order to route to something for the first time.
So if you were to like make like a beginner friendly version of this example, would you start with the routes just loading all the components individually?
Yeah, but I guess with the preload strategy, I forget how that changes. Yeah, like if you're learning Angular, like you wouldn't want to lazy load your modules. Like that's like if you go on the Angular docs, that's like all the way down towards the bottom.
And what would be the analog? Is there an analog to that, Min, on the React side? Do you know?
For lazy loading?
Yeah.
Yeah. So React has like, you know, like there is like a lazy and the idea of like suspense where it loads like later on, and then you just wrap your like routes within those components. So like the functionality is there, but again, it's the same thing. You gotta have real strong understanding of like how your component tree works, and like you just put those routes in there, then those codes, will have those route-based code splitting for you. It's also in the React docs too, so it's like pretty easy to pick it up. But like you got to understand the whole like idea of how all that lazy loading like what it means for your code first. But like the implementation isn't too difficult. And everything just comes back to the same idea. It's just a component with children, right? And whatever's inside of it renders. And all that magic code that happens is like within those components. So it could also be a little bit hard depending on like, how well you understand like where everything that's happening. But yeah, like I do agree though, like Angular would be a little bit easier like for monolithic projects because it's a singular convention. Whereas like for React, you need to have like one or two key people to define what the the convention is and keep your internal code base opinionated. So it's like the rules on you. But you have all the flexibility and all the ability to test all your routing like a lot easier.
So to that question you mentioned earlier, like it's up to someone to define the convention. Do you think that like obviously there's many ways to do things in React, but like would this vary vastly like if someone were to like do this in like a completely different way?
Not so much. It's not even about like how to make it work. It's more about where you put everything in the code. Like in Angular, it's like you have the routing module, right? And then like the module, like there's a module like and tree for everything. Whereas React, you can put anything anywhere. It's more about code organization. Because I think at the end of the day, anybody can look at the routes and like kind of read it, and it's not too difficult. But when you have like multiple sub routes for like various parts of the UI, that's when it can get confusing.
Yeah, and one of the points that Matt from Ionic has mentioned in the comments, moving between Angular and React, regardless of what you choose, it's very helpful that Ionic framework components and concepts translate over between the two as well. So you could start with, if it's a simple project, you can start with React. As it grows, you can either try to adjust with redefining how you're doing your React code, or if you need something more robust, it's easy to translate over to Angular without fully starting from scratch.
Well, great. I think for this being probably the biggest topic, I think we got a lot of good discussion out there. And if anyone in the audience still has any more questions about that, feel free to put them in there, and we'll try to field them as it goes. But I think we are ready to move on to our next topic, which is very prevalent in mobile development. And I think this time we got Pablo going first, but Greg, since you were just speaking, do you want to give like a brief overview of what like deep linking is?
Yeah, deep linking is something that I most recently used on a project, and I used React for it. Is basically navigating the user from, say, an email or from some website deep into a specific section of your web app. From a routing standpoint, that could also include making sure they're authenticated, but it'll take them to a specific part of the app instead of having to go through the front door. So that's basically the high-level definition of what we're talking about when it comes to deep linking.
Cool. And I noticed in both examples, we're going to be seeing the way to do this with capacitor, which we've talked extensively in previous meetups. But before, have you ever tried doing it messing with the service worker itself?
No, I have not. But that is definitely one of the options that you could do. Yep.
Yes, I think as we go through these next examples, if anyone's curious out there and wants to see how that would be done with the service worker, I think you'll appreciate the solution that Capacitor has put over. But following right along, we'll begin with you, Pablo, on the Angular side.
Oh, don't skip the joke. Yeah.
Oh, the joke. Yes, I forgot. Great Jeff Goldblum here.
Yep.
Saying that if you're an Angular or React guy, well, what's the difference? They're both JavaScript. Got to go with your JavaScript first. All right. So Pablo, you are up.
Perfect. Well, this is my first meetup, so I'm going to introduce myself just a little bit. I'm Pablo. I work in OpenForge, and I'm from Mexico. Well, for this example, I tried to make it the simplest ways possible because I didn't want to share a lot of code on the presentation. Well, first, everything you need to set it up on the app component inside the initialize app method that it's on Ionic. So when you have the links that you're going to need to route from the outside, well, in this case, it's just one. It's just to one link that's called posts. After that, the deep link route acts like some kind of listener. So if there's a request from one link to that route with the host that you define on the installation, there's going to be a match on the route. That way you can create an internal path and use it to navigate to exactly where part of the app you need to show. So, well, that's basically is the setup, and now all you need at first in this example. So for me in Angular, I think that is really straightforward to do because you use a lot of libraries that Angular gives you, like, for example, router, that is like a really basic Angular library to navigate, or the sun.run or whatever. So that's why I think that is really easy to use on Angular, and you don't have to do a lot of code on the setup part. On the part of setting up the links for Android and iOS, that's another story, but that has nothing to do with Angular or React. So yeah, that's basically it. What you need for deep linking.
Great. So, Greg, so I took a chance to peek at the, well, I prepared the slides, so I saw them, but we're going to notice that they're fairly similar. I think out of all of the three examples, these are probably the most similar of them. So with that, I'll let Greg go on and show us the React example.
Yeah, like you said, these two examples are very similar. One of the things that, one of the reasons I wanted to choose this one is to kind of accent some of the minor differences. One of them being the flexibility. This code that you see here is basically a deep link listener component that I built that you just interject into the Ion React router, but you could also put it in the router itself and wrap the router, put all this stuff inside there if you need some more complex business logic behind it. On the next slide, you'll see the very similar implementation. This includes all the imports, so there's really not much more code to the React as it was with Angular, because at the end of the day, it's the same TypeScript or JavaScript that you would use to implement it in both solutions, splitting up the URL, making sure the path has a route within your application. In this case, I implemented it in such a way that if there isn't a match for the deep link, then we just toss it over to the regular routing in case there is a standard route that's not necessarily a deep link, whether that means taking them to their main page or to some other information that you want to present to the user. So at the end of the day, I think the flexibility that React itself provides in being able to implement this capacitor plugin as a part of your app is probably where I would say React is the stronger candidate between the two. Again, this particular example, I just built a component that implements it by itself, but I could integrate it into a React router wrapper to be able to implement that inside there, especially if I have to also implement an auth route to be able to protect certain routes. I might then integrate this within that authentication layer as well. Whereas with Angular, I believe you're mainly just putting it into the controller component to be able to implement all that, and then have the auth router on a separate thing. You can still do it the same way, and it all at the end of the day works the same, thanks to the beauty, what I call the beauty of Ionic. It helps you implement all of these things without having the headache of trying to figure out, how does this work on mobile? How does this work on desktop, or even on Electron now? But yeah, simply put, here we just listen for the app open or URL open trigger from the capacitor plugin, check to see what the slug is, so we know what route to take within there. And again, if there's no match, it just tosses it back over to the regular router that's already been implemented. If you go back one slide, basically I show deep link listener above the rest of the routing mechanism that's built in. So sort of a hijack there. And then if it doesn't have any deep link route, it'll just pass it on over to the regular Ion router outlet.
Now, seeing this, is that the case simply because you placed it above the router? It just goes there first and then passes it all along?
Yep. Yeah, it just kind of hijack the way or interjects itself in there just before that, before you want to implement the split pane. So, yep.
Very interesting. Anyone else from the team that's taking a look at this? I personally like that a lot.
I think that's a really cool component. Could we also turn that into like a reusable hook too?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
You just make the app use that hook, right?
Yeah, you could turn it into a hook and then put it into any of your other high-level components that you may be implementing in your app.
Oh, React with its hooks and props.
Yeah, we really didn't talk about much hooks in this talk, but yeah, that's another power to what I feel is a superpower to React.
Okay.
And I'm speaking coming from an Angular background, so my React background has just been a year, and I absolutely love it.
That's awesome. Do you consider yourself a React main as of now, or would you still?
Absolutely.
Wow.
Yep.
I don't know if I'm quite ready to make that leap first, but it's certainly luring me more and more. Well, great. I don't think we have any outstanding questions from the audience. If you do, speak up now. But yeah, I want to thank everyone for participating. I know it's hard. It's a topic that's hard because you have to show preference on some things or another. But I think it was very useful to do this, especially for beginners. As in one of our in the meetup that Luis manages in Costa Rica, we heard from a lot of people who are interested in Ionic but are still not sure whether to start out with Angular or React. But I think that these examples really help people be more informed and perhaps know what they want to start out with. So yeah, without further ado, I want to thank everyone. And as you know, you can find us over at openforge.io, and the slides have been made available in the meetup page. So we included 2 videos from our YouTube channel. So if you want to do that and check it out, feel more than free to do so. And as always, do some outreach if you're interested about any particular topic. Reach out to us either through our website or on Twitter or YouTube channel. We are going to monitor those for topics that you guys want us to talk about, and we're going to try to keep these as consistent as we've been. And yeah, I think that might be it. So if there's nothing from the hosts, I'd like to thank you again, and thank you all for tuning in.
And now I'll tell you what you've won. You've learned some of the pros and cons of 2 great choices. You now can decide what's best for you on your next Ionic project. After all, everyone who uses Ionic is already a winner.
Woo! All right. Well, thank you, everyone. See you online.